Greetings and welcome to Wisconsin in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent, Ben Yount. We are recording this on Thursday, September 7th. Ben, the Wisconsin Badgers and new head coach Luke Fickell are 1-0 on the season after beating Buffalo last weekend, 38-17. Despite the win, many are saying it wasn't a very good showing. What say you?
Well, look, Wisconsin can run the ball. We could run the ball under the last coach and the coach before him and Barry Alvarez. Wisconsin has great offensive linemen and really good running backs. And we saw that on Saturday. They didn't bring this guy in to run the ball. They brought this guy in for the air raid offense. And so we'll have to see how that works. Good news is, though, is we get these powerhouses in Washington State and Georgia Southern over the next two games. I love me some Badger football, but the Big Ten still has Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, and Minnesota always finds a way to stick it in our eye. So, let's on Wisconsin to a middling season because the Big Ten. And look, this is even before we get the new Big Ten powerhouses of USC and UCLA.
My Ohio State Buckeyes struggled a little bit early on, so it's a long season. There's always a bit of overreaction after week one. Let's come back to this in a few weeks and see how those Badgers
is Marvin Harrison still getting off the bus? As long as Marvin Harrison Jr. is still getting off the bus in Columbus, I think you guys are going to be okay.
Man, 2 catches in week one. I don't know what to say. We'll see. All right, Ben, let's get into it. Ever since new Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Janet Protasiewicz was elected to the bench earlier this year, tipping the state Supreme Court from Republican dominant to Democratic dominant, we knew there were going to be issues. And now a couple of Republicans in Wisconsin are talking about the I word, impeachment. What's going on here?
This is getting out of hand in terms of the politics of the court. For every step that Republicans seem to take, Democrats take another step. And we very well could find ourselves with an impeachment proceeding. And don't let me forget to make that point coming up here. Wisconsin's race for the Supreme Court was the most expensive in the nation and is so far the most expensive in the nation's history. And it was that much for a reason. When you control the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which liberals haven't done in 15 or so years, you control a state that is a bellwether. You control a state that is going to be one of 5 battleground states in the 2024 presidential election. And you control a state that sort of was a conservative oasis at a time when the rest of the upper Midwest was a solidly Democratic bloc. Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan. And so Democrats in Wisconsin have been waiting for their chance to flip this court. And when they did, they saw an open path to changing the state's abortion law, to changing the political maps in the state, to making sure that whatever happens with elections in Wisconsin doesn't change too much. There's even talk of perhaps going back to 2010, 2011 and overturning Act 10 that changed the rules for how teachers could negotiate. There are some who want to repeal the right to work law here in Wisconsin. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of progressive hopes and dreams for this court. And so that's why it was a $50-something million race for the Supreme Court. Janet Protasiewicz won, and she took her oath of office in early August. And almost immediately I'm talking next day or within days, you had progressive groups in the state asking to redraw the political maps immediately before the 2024 election. And you had the state's attorney general ask to fast track the hearing that would overturn Wisconsin's pre-Roe abortion law. Abortion can wait because that's not involved in impeachment. The impeachment question centers around what Protasiewicz said during the campaign about Wisconsin's political maps. She said they were unfair, said they were rigged for Republicans, and said that she would be willing to take a look to draw new maps. Republicans here in Wisconsin say she prejudiced herself. As a Supreme Court justice, you're supposed to weigh cases based on the facts. You're not supposed to bring in your personal ideas. The Supreme Court is not a political apparatus. It is supposed to be above the fray. Democrats, of course, want nothing of this. They pointed to a story that we wrote this week that said the state's Judicial Commission back in May said Protasiewicz will not be sanctioned. She will not be punished. They have dismissed the complaints about her comments about redistricting, and that hasn't ended the talk of impeachment. In fact, you have more and more Republicans, and we wrote the story. You're right. 2 state lawmakers, Dan Knodel, who heads the Senate Committee on Elections, and State Senator Van Wangard, who say impeachment now needs to be on the table to deal with how this liberal court is handling its new liberal majority. And as Wangard said, abusing its power. As Knodel said, perhaps Protasiewicz should step aside lest she be removed.
So Ben, I got to say that I'm not completely clear on the impeachment process in Wisconsin. Of course, over the last few years, Americans as a whole have undergone a couple of impeachments when it comes to former President Donald Trump. Does the process in Wisconsin work somewhat similar, at least? I know every state has their own set of rules and laws dictating this, but the Assembly would have to impeach, and then the Senate would hold a trial if it came to that.
Yeah, it's very similar to the federal process in that, the Assembly, the state representatives, the people's house would first hold the hearing. They would begin the impeachment proceedings, and then the Senate, the upper chamber, would actually have to remove her. One of the wrinkles of this entire process is that you don't have to go through with it in order to keep Janet Protasiewicz from ruling on a redistricting case. That the way Wisconsin law is written is that as soon as an impeachment proceeding begins, Protasiewicz would have to step aside. She could not hear cases while she is at the center of an impeachment process. So she doesn't have to be convicted. She doesn't even have to be impeached. Just the fact that the impeachment proceeding has begun freezes her. That then deadlocks Wisconsin Supreme Court as a 3-3 court. Though Brian Hagedorn, who was elected with conservative support, is a swing vote and sometimes rules with liberal justices. But this does not have to go all the way down to a Senate trial and a conviction and remove Protasiewicz, and then we have a brand new, expensive as all get out race for Supreme Court. They could play some Vulcan chess here and freeze Protasiewicz just by beginning the process. That brings us to the other story that we wrote, and I feel that we've written 3 or 4 or 5 of these in the past week. The other story that we wrote just the other day, that Democrats here in Wisconsin, the state Democratic Party, has announced a $4 million campaign fund, essentially, to target any Republican lawmaker who even talks about impeachment. This isn't votes for impeachment. This is out in their local newspaper, talking to their local radio station, being on their local television station, talking about impeachment, that they can expect to have this Democratic money spent against them in the next election. And the implication, of course, state representatives are up for reelection next year. Many of these races are low dollar races. So millions upon millions of dollars pumped into, say, a state representative race in Saukville could absolutely change what happens there. Republican Speaker Robin Vos said that the move shows that the Democratic Party and Janet Protasiewicz are one and the same. But still no one is talking about actually beginning the impeachment process, because once you do, if people thought that opening the door to impeachment of former President Trump opened a whole can of worms, here in Wisconsin, even moving towards impeaching Janet Protasiewicz is going to cause one domino and then another and then another and then another, and we're off to the races. And honestly, I've watched politics in this state for years. I couldn't guess as to what's going to happen and then what happens after that happens.
Interesting stuff, Ben. It doesn't sound like this fight over the Wisconsin State Supreme Court is going away anytime soon. Listeners can keep up with it with all of Ben's coverage at thecentersquare.com, but we are out of time. For Ben Yount, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thanks for listening.